Tokyo's Ginza, 1986. Neon floods the night, and packed nightclubs overflow with cash and ambition. Money flows like sake here, abundant and unceasing, poured freely through Japan's booming, unstoppable streets. But this exact party ends in sudden silence. The loudest room in Asia gone completely quiet. Therefore, one hidden mechanic built this miracle, then quietly broke it apart in months. Before we go further, subscribe, because the next few minutes change how you see money completely. Now rewind. How did a shattered island outbuild the entire industrial world so fast? From 1955, Japan's economy exploded 435% in just 2 decades. Economists gave it a name, the Japanese miracle, growth the modern world had never witnessed. By the 80s, Japan stood as the world's second largest economy, trailing only the United States. Made in Japan once meant cheap novelty. Suddenly it meant precision, quality, real innovation. Toyota, Sony, Nissan, Mitsubishi. Household names now, born straight out of that same surge. But look closer. 8 of the world's largest banks were suddenly, quietly Japanese. Those 8 banks alone held $2.3 trillion in securities combined. Therefore, Japan alone had the resources to buy every major bank on Wall Street. Land values soared too. Japan's tiny footprint, valued at 4 times America's own land. The Imperial Palace grounds alone outvalued the entire state of California on paper. It felt eternal, like the sun would simply never set on Tokyo's rise. But on January 1st, 1990, doubt quietly crept into the market's confidence. Over 2.5 years, share prices collapsed by 63%. Millions lost their savings overnight. Banks failed. The miracle simply stopped breathing. Companies that borrowed against paper wealth collapsed into sudden cascading bankruptcy. History named this stretch simply the lost decades. Stagnation with no clear end. Young Japanese stopped marrying. Birth rates slowed toward historic, unprecedented lows. Therefore, the population began aging fast with far fewer workers left to replace it. So what actually broke this golden machine? The real answer starts decades earlier. Rewind to 1945, a Japan flattened by war and completely broke. Washington needed proof capitalism could thrive outside the West. Japan became that proof. In 1949, America pegged the yen artificially, deliberately low against the dollar. Therefore, Japanese goods became irresistibly cheap for American buyers almost overnight. The US assumed its own market could simply absorb every import Japan sent. But that quiet assumption would backfire spectacularly within just 3 decades. 1952, occupation ends, and Japan's economy explodes into overdrive. Growth averaged 10% a year, for 2 straight decades, unbroken. A cheap, disciplined workforce fed heavy industry at a genuinely staggering pace. This is the Keiretsu, companies bound together like one loyal, protective family. Keiretsu members shared resources freely, protecting each other through every downturn. Call it a cartel if you like, but a genuinely cooperative one, built on loyalty. Behind it all, the Bank of Japan quietly steered lending through so-called window guidance. That guidance funneled credit straight into shipbuilding, coal and steel, the vital sectors. The goal was simple: pump investment, ramp production, and grow the economy fast. So Japan bet everything on conquering the entire global export market all at once. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics became the stage to prove it to the world. By the 1980s, Japan stands as an undisputed economic powerhouse, second only to America. But this triumph is about to become its own trap. Here's the twist. Success itself is the danger. The more Japan sells America, the closer both nations edge toward open economic war. A record trade surplus is coming, one so massive it will drag Washington to a hotel in New York to stop it. By 1986, that surplus hits $827 billion, the largest trade imbalance the post-war world has ever seen. Japanese cars, televisions, and cameras flood American shelves by the millions, each one cheaper, sharper, better built than its American rival. Therefore, American factory jobs vanish by the thousands. Workers watch assembly lines go quiet and demand someone make Japan pay. U.S. lawmakers stand and warn, unless something changes now, retaliation and full-blown trade war sit just around the corner. Washington makes its decision. Japan's rise must be slowed, deliberately, before it swallows what's left of American industry. 1985, officials from 5 nations, France, Germany, Britain, America, and Japan, gather quietly inside New York's Plaza Hotel. The deal struck there gets a name, the Plaza Accord. Japan agrees, astonishingly, to strengthen its own currency against itself. The plan is simple on paper: raise the yen, lower the dollar, make Japanese exports too expensive to keep winning. In effect, Japan hands its own exporters a self-imposed handicap, like a champion agreeing to fight with one hand tied. Picture holding the winning hand and choosing to weaken it yourself. Would you have signed that agreement? Tell Thomas below. But Japan's own consumers actually want this too. A stronger yen means cheaper imports, cheaper oil, cheaper everything from abroad. Officials genuinely believe a robust yen will force innovation, sharpen competitiveness, and strengthen Japan for decades to come. By 1987, the accord meets its goal. Washington is satisfied. The yen has climbed exactly as everyone hoped. But the yen doesn't stop climbing. It surges far faster than any official predicted, and nobody ordered this much. Japanese officials watch the currency charts in real alarm. The tool built to save their economy now threatens to break it. Therefore, panic authorities loosen credit and slash interest rates, hoping cheaper money will cushion the shock before it spreads. Rates fall all the way to 2.5%, the lowest interest rate anywhere in the entire world. Cheap money now floods every corner of the economy, searching for somewhere anywhere to multiply itself overnight. Borrowing turns almost irresistibly cheap. Banks and investors alike start treating debt like free money with no ceiling. Thomas explains it plainly. Banks now hold the leash on every deal in Japan. They decide who grows and who starves. The state quietly directs which banks receive funding, steering the flow of loans toward favored industries and allies. Therefore, investors take that borrowed money and pour it straight into real estate, chasing land instead of factories. Tokyo's land is scarce to begin with. Now demand collides with that scarcity, and prices simply go vertical. Even ordinary farmers sitting on inherited plots wake up as paper millionaires, richer on paper than they ever imagined. 60% of Japanese households now own their own home, and homeowners everywhere feel wealthier than ever before. But rising land prices don't stay contained. They spill directly into the stock market, inflating it right alongside them. A feedback loop forms. Land inflates stocks, stocks inflate confidence, confidence inflates land again, faster each time around. Between 1985 and 1989, stocks surged 240% and land 245%. Companies exploit this by citing their rising land holdings to inflate reported profits on paper without producing anything more. That artificial wealth props up share prices even further, convincing everyone the boom is built on something real. Therefore, firms stop focusing on building products and start chasing pure speculation instead, treating markets like casinos. A major car maker now earns more money from financial speculation than it does from selling actual cars. Open loop. A stranger boom than real estate or stocks is about to appear, one measured in golf clubs. Japanese executives start trading golf club memberships like stocks, bidding each other into an entirely new kind of frenzy. A single membership now sells for $3.5 million, the price of a mansion, for a tea time. Thomas turns to camera. Subscribe now, because the maddest reveal in this entire bubble is coming up next. The entire golf membership market swells to $200 billion in total value, traded like any other asset class. Therefore, that sum alone dwarfs the entire economy of Taiwan and edges close to matching South Korea's GDP. Picture a gilded thread of debt running through every deal: land, stocks, golf clubs, all borrowed, all connected, all about to snap. One golden thread runs through every ledger and deal about to unfold. Therefore, Japan's global shopping spree traces back to a single source: cheap, borrowed money. But awash in borrowed cash, Japanese firms went shopping across the entire globe, snapping up landmarks, studios, and land in country after country. First came Rockefeller Center itself. Mitsubishi Estate bought a controlling stake in New York's most iconic address, a symbol of American power now owned from Tokyo. Therefore, Sony went further still, purchasing Columbia Pictures outright in 1989, buying not just a studio, but Hollywood's entire back catalog of stories. But it wasn't just glamour. In 1986, Japan quietly bought 75% of every U.S. government bond sold that year, bankrolling America's own debt. Therefore, as long as currency dealers stayed silent about the yen's true value, Japan could keep printing money and trading it for real assets abroad. But at home, the Bank of Japan pushed harder still, urging commercial banks to keep lending without ever checking whether the loans made economic sense. Therefore, optimism became the real danger. Everyone was making money, so regulators simply chose not to look at the risk piling up beneath the boom. By 1989, the total value of Japan's private land had ballooned to 2,000 trillion yen, up from 14.2 trillion 2 decades earlier. But the alarm finally rang. In 1989, regulators capped bank loans tied directly to real estate, trying to choke off the speculation at last. Therefore, interest rates climbed too, rising from 2.5% to 4.25%, then settling at 6% by 1990. But by then, the damage was already done. Land and stock prices had been propped up so high that even a small correction would collapse everything at once. Here's the golden thread laid bare. Cheap credit didn't create wealth, it created a gilded illusion of it. If that just reframed the entire decade for you. Subscribe, the next thread pulls even tighter. Therefore, the collapse came fast. Land values and stock prices fell together in a spiraling panic, each decline dragging the other lower in a vicious feedback loop. In 1990 alone, Japan's stock market dropped 32%, erasing years of speculative gains in a matter of months as investors rushed for the exit. But the losses ran deeper still. By December of that year, more than $2 trillion in market value had simply vanished into thin air. Therefore, in July of 1991, the Bank of Japan abandoned window guidance entirely, the very lending system that had inflated the bubble in the first place. But without that guiding hand, Keiretsu banks themselves began collapsing, and each failing bank threatened to drag its entire allied sector down along with it. Between 1990 and 2003, 212,000 Japanese businesses declared bankruptcy, wiping out decades of family enterprise in barely a decade. Therefore, 5 million Japanese workers lost their jobs in that same span, and many of them never found stable employment again for the rest of their lives. The human cost cut deeper than any balance sheet. Suicide became the leading cause of death for Japanese men between 20 and 44 years old, but the market itself never recovered. From peak to trough, it fell 80%, and decades later, it still hasn't reclaimed those 1989 highs. Therefore, the very people who built those glittering skyscrapers ended up sleeping on the streets they once looked down on from the top floor. By 1995, Mitsubishi Estate quietly sold Rockefeller Center back to its American owners, the crown jewel of the shopping spree finally slipping away. In 1989, 32 of the world's 50 largest companies were Japanese. Today, only one remains on that list, Toyota, alone where an empire once stood. But the wreckage wasn't only financial. Japan's sacred promise of a job for life was about to shatter too, and nobody was ready for what came next. Therefore, Ford stepped in to run Mazda, and Western executives slashed the workforce down to 26,000 employees, a brutal jolt to Japan's corporate pride. But this wasn't just one factory. Japan's celebrated lifetime employment management model, once studied worldwide as gospel, was now publicly and humiliatingly shattered. Therefore, the rigid bureaucracy that once powered Japan's rise became the very shackles holding its recovery back, unable to bend fast enough to survive. Here's the twist. The nation that built the world's most advanced electronics was strangely slow to even put computers in its own offices. If you know someone still stuck in the shadow of a collapse like this, drop it in the comments below. But the heaviest fallout landed on the youngest generation, the ones just stepping into a workforce that had quietly stopped hiring altogether. Therefore, ambition collided head-on with a job market that had simply vanished, leaving graduates with degrees, discipline, and nowhere left to spend either. For some, the pressure became unbearable, and they withdrew completely, becoming what Japan calls hikikomori, shut-ins who stopped leaving their rooms entirely. One father describes his son withdrawing as a teenager, and 2 decades later still barely leaving his room, with no hope left in sight. Japan's Cabinet Office now estimates 63,000 middle-aged and elderly hikikomori remain hidden today, still dependent on aging parents who cannot care forever. Therefore, Japan's GDP growth crawled to little more than 1% across 2 straight decades, a stagnation unmatched by any other developed economy. But nature delivered its own blow. In 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami struck northeastern Japan, killing thousands and shifting the very Earth's axis. Therefore, the Fukushima nuclear disaster that followed compounded decades of economic scarring, adding a fresh trauma on top of a wound that never healed. Today, Japan stands as one of the fastest aging nations on Earth, with a growing share of its population over 65 and few young workers left to support them. In 2023, Japan recorded just 758,000 births, a drop of 5.1%, the lowest birth rate ever recorded there. Therefore, young Japanese increasingly cite crushing living costs and relentless work pressure as reasons to skip marriage and children altogether, breaking the thread for good. Decades after the crash, Japan finally lost its silver medal, slipping from the 3rd largest economy on Earth to 4th, overtaken after years of interest rates stuck near zero. Here's the golden thread running through it all. Cheap money is never free, it's a loan against tomorrow, and history keeps proving the bill always comes due. Tonight, Ginza's neon still flickers electric over the crowded streets, but the confetti of easy money is gone, and the lesson written in that skyline is the same one Japan is still paying for. If this changed how you see a headline like that, that's the like button. Tell me below, what would you do with a mountain of cheap money? Subscribe, the next Gilded Thread starts now.